Proverbs chapter 4, we want to look at our Old Testament text. We've been looking at numerous chapters of Proverbs, and so we want to continue to look at Proverbs chapter 4, and then we'll go to the text that's for our message this morning from Job chapter 1 and 2. Let's read Proverbs chapter 4 together. Listen, my sons, to a father's instructions. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning. Do not forget my teaching. When I was a boy in my father's house, still tender and an only child of my mother, he taught me and said, lay hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding, and do not forget my words or swerve from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. Wisdom is supreme. Therefore, get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Esteem her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will set a garland of grace on your head and present you with a crown of splendor. Listen, my son. Accept what I say, and the years of your life will be many. I will guide you in the way of wisdom and lead you along straight paths. When you walk, your steps will not be hampered, and when you run, you will not stumble. Hold on to instruction and do not let it go. Guard it well, for it is your life. Do not set foot on the path of the wicked or walk in the way of evil men. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn from it and go on your way, for they cannot sleep till they do evil. They are robbed of slumber till they make someone fall. They eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. The path of the righteous is like the first gleam of dawn, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. But the way of the wicked, it's like deep darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. My son, pay attention to what I say. Listen closely to my words. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to a man's whole body. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Put away perversity from your mouth. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. Let your eyes gaze straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you, and make level paths for your feet. And take only ways that are firm. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. And keep your foot from evil. The wisdom of Proverbs to those that have the ears to listen. We are entering into what is the fourth Sunday in our sermon series on learning, leaning, and leading. And so we were talking about in this year, 2019, that's all about fellowship. We're looking at some specific relationships that we have in our lives that are necessary to be able to live well. And so we spent the first 2 weeks of this series talking about learning. Is there someone in our life that we have given, because as responsible adults or as growing adults, we are able to allow people kind of into our life or exclude them. Have we allowed someone the authority to speak into our life with authority? Someone that we can learn from and that we're willing to learn from, and someone that will lead us on the right paths. And we looked in the second week of that series that we also need someone in our life that's willing to challenge us. Not just tell us what we want to hear and not just give a thumbs up to everything we want to do, but do we have that someone into our life that speaks with authority, that's also able to push back when pushing back is necessary, that doesn't make everything easy for us, but allows us to learn along that process. So we spent the first 2 weeks looking at learning. Do we have someone to learn from? And then these 2 weeks about leaning. Do we have someone that we can really lean upon? Last week, considered David and Jonathan, and how David and Jonathan, they had this thing called loyalty. And do we have someone in our life that's loyal, that we can lean upon, who will encourage us, will speak the truth to us, and will walk alongside us? Well, this week we're continuing on in that series about leaning on someone, and I've chosen, I want to consider Job's 3 friends. So, Job's 3 friends. Now, Job's 3 friends, they get a bad rep, I'm afraid. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Job, and I put chapters 1 and 2 on the reading for today, but that's a lot of material to read in the time we have together, so we're going to have to summarize a little bit. Job 1 and 2. But if you remember, Job was a man who lived in the land of Uz. And Job was a righteous man and a good man. Not because I say so, but because the text says so. The text tells us that he was a righteous man. He seems to be presented as a man really without flaw in the beginning. And he's very wealthy. He has 7 wonderful children, and things seem to be going well for him. So let's begin by looking a little bit at the beginning chapter that I just described to you, and then we'll move on and get to the point where Job's 3 friends enter the picture. So in Job chapter 1, in the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. He was blameless, and he was upright. He feared God, and he shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their sisters to eat and drink with them. And when a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. So here we have this man living in the land of Uz, and he was a good and blameless and righteous man. Now, please forgive my use of technology, but without printers working, I'm going to have to look at my notes on my tablet. And so if I look down at this little thing, I'm not checking my email. I need it for the notes. So what we want to do is we look at this account of Job and his 3 friends. We want to do this by location. So we begin by this journey that Job's going to have with his friends. We're going to start in the land of Uz. And what do we learn about Job living in the land of Uz? That he is blameless, that he is upright, that he fears God, and that God has blessed everything that he has. So that's the location in the land of Uz. Well, the second thing that happens in the book of Job is that we very much switch locations. And the book of Job describes for us a scene that doesn't take place in the land of Uz or even on earth, but it transfers to God's heavenly throne room, God's heavenly scene. So let's look at what undertakes Job in this second location that Job has no access to, and eventually Job's friends, they'll have no access to. This is something that takes place far beyond what human beings have access to. So one day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There was no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the works of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. We turn to this next scene. So Job's friends haven't come into the picture yet, but we do have this conversation between the Lord and Satan. Now, just a little bit of background on Satan in this particular book. When you read the Satan role in the book of Job, it's not so much meant to be, even though it's capitalized in almost all the translations, it's not so much an individual's name as it is a role. A role. So at this point in the book of Job, Satan is not this evil figure that has horns and tails and so often is characterized this way. But the Satan seems to be a member of God's court, and his role is to accuse those who are leading a life of, trying to live a life of faithfulness. Satan seems to be the one that tests their mettle. So to give you an example, this is Independence Day weekend. And so you've managed to break off, and you don't quite have the same political system that you would have had if perhaps that war had not been fought, the War of Independence hadn't been fought. So let me give you a little insight into what would have happened if you would have kept a parliamentary system, as they have in Canada. So in Canada, when we have elections, and there should be one coming up at the end of this year, we have a number of parties in Canada. So we have the Liberal Party, we have the Progressive Conservative Party, we have the New Democratic Party, we have the Green Party, we have the Bloc Québécois, that's in Quebec, a whole bunch of different parties. And so we'll hold a federal election, but you don't elect the Prime Minister. In fact, what you do is you vote for the people that are running in your little district, and you vote whether you want the person who happens to be a liberal or happens to be a Democrat or happens to be a whatever, New Democrat, to be your representative. And so you only really are thinking about the person who's going to be your representative for your riding. Then when all the people vote for the people in their riding, and they all go to Ottawa, the capital, whichever party has the most representatives, their leader becomes the Prime Minister. If it happens to be the people form a majority of the parliament, then they are a majority leader, and if they don't have a majority, then they're the minority leader, but they nevertheless are called the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister then is the leader of the government, and he has his cabinet. Just like you have a cabinet here, we would have a cabinet, someone who acts like the Minister of the Exterior, Minister of the Interior, Minister of Secretary, Minister of Justice, and so on and so on. So that's the ruling party. The party that gets the second most votes, they have a special name, the second most vote. You only have a two-party system. When you have a five-party system, the party that has the second most votes has a very special role. And they are called, in Canada, as they are in New Zealand, as they are in Britain, they are called Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And they also have a cabinet. Every position that the government has, Minister of the Interior, Exterior, Treasury, whatever it is, there is Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition also has a person that has that role. And their job, essentially, is to stick it to the government and make sure that they are held accountable for all the decisions that they make. And they are the loyal opposition. They're not there just to undo everything they do, but they're to make sure that they are held accountable for the decisions that are being made. That's the system. You're lucky we all escaped it, because it's still politics. It's awful. But when you think of the Satan role in the book of Job, it's like His Majesty's loyal opposition. The role is to test, to try, to push back a little bit. Are these people that say they're followers of you, these people who seek to be loyal members of your kingdom, are they really who we think they are? Let's push back and let's test them a little bit to see if that's the way they truly are and behave. And so, when God, who brings up Job to the Satan, says, "Have you considered my servant Job? Look how wonderful he is." The Satan, in that role of the loyal opposition, says, "Is he really all that you think he is?" Let's test that out. And God gives them the opportunity to test that out. Now, if you read through the first two chapters, you'll find out there's not just one test, but there's two. In the first test, Job loses everything that he has. He loses his children. He loses his wealth. He's a broken man. And yet, it tells us at the end of chapter 1 that in all of his distress, he did not sin against God. That famous line, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Well, we come to the heavenly throne room again, and we get a second discussion. "Have you considered my servant Job? Look at all that you did to him, and still, blameless and upright, fears God." Skin for skin, the Satan says. Skin for skin. A man will give all that he has in exchange for his life. But if you reach out and touch his flesh, he'll curse you to his face. Very well, the Lord says. Everything that is his is in your hands. You just can't take his life. And so the second test that comes upon Job is he gets loathsome sores from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Now, if you know anything about diseases in the ancient world, loathsome sores means that you get cut off. And so what we find is that Job has to leave his house because these loathsome sores would make him unclean, a potential source of infection. He has to leave what he has left, which is his endearing wife, who tells him to curse God and die. And he goes and he sits on the ash heap. He scrapes his loathsome sores with little shards of pottery that he has there. So we've moved from the land of Uz to the heavenly throne room scene, back to the land of Uz, back to the throne room scene, and now we find ourselves sitting with Job on the ash heap. And that's where we're introduced to Job's three friends. In chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, this is what we read about Job and his friends. Chapter 2, verse 11. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes, and they met together by agreement to go and to sympathize with him and to comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes, they sprinkled dust on their heads, and they sat on the ground with him 7 days and 7 nights. And no one said a word to him, because they saw how great was his suffering. Talking about locations, the three friends heard about Job's trouble in their own home. They weren't in the same place as Job, but they were friends with Job because he was the greatest man of the East. In their own locations, they found him. They traveled to meet up together, and together they came and they sat with Job. These men, as much as they get a bad reputation sometimes, poor comforters they'll be called a little bit later on. In chapter 42, even God will chastise them for not saying what's right. But in the beginning, they do exactly what friends should do. They leave their homes. They drop everything. They go to Job, and they sit. And they sit with Job in his misery. Sometimes when we encounter people that are going through suffering, we are quick to try to fill up the space with words. And sometimes that's just the wrong thing to do. One of the deacons have been going through training this year on what it means to have teams, deacon teams. And so to start off that training, we had a series of videos that talked about what deacon ministry looks like if it was done by teams. And as part of that, the pastor there shared some stories about some things that maybe deacons didn't do quite right because they're a little bit too quick to use their words. And again, it's not just confined to deacons. I think we all make those sort of things. So he shares a story about a woman who was in hospital, and she had become ill, and she was facing some surgery. And so a well-meaning deacon went to go see her and went in to visit with her, which is the proper thing to do, and spent some time with her. And eventually, after the kind of talk that's kind of light and fluffy, it turns towards the more serious thing about what's actually wrong and why she's in hospital. And she expressed to him the illness and also the treatment that she was supposed to go through. To which the deacon replied, "Oh my aunt died from that." Job's three friends sitting there for 7 days and 7 nights and not saying anything, that's probably a much better pastoral care track than trying to fill in things with words. So why do they get such a bad reputation then if they do what seems to be the right thing? They simply sit with him in his suffering and they share in that moment because there's really nothing that can be done. There's really no answer to be given, and you and I as readers, we know that because we know that what's happened to Job has nothing to do with what he did or where he's been or who he associates with. It's all beyond his control. Well, Job's three friends get in trouble, not because they do the wrong thing by sitting with him, but they get in trouble because they move locations. They move locations. If you read in chapter 3, actually Job is the one that speaks first. And in chapter 3, you encounter after 7 days, he opens his mouth and he begins to talk about his situation. And in the midst of talking about his situation, he more or less lays out, this is an awful circumstance that I'm in. I wish that I'd never been born. Wish that I'd never been born. But I was born. So he lays out a second scenario. I was born, but I wish I had died a stillbirth. I wish I had come forth from the womb and just expired. That would be better than the situation I'm in now. But I didn't. So here's the third best option. Why doesn't God just take my life now? Because my suffering is so great. So Job begins this conversation with his three friends, exploring the meaning of his suffering. And here's the problem that the three friends get into. They decide to move from their location, which is sitting beside Job in the ash heap, and they decide to transplant themselves as if they themselves are part of that heavenly court and having a conversation with God. Because they begin not to sympathize with Job in his suffering, but they begin to respond to Job's questions. They begin to tell Job that God's righteous, that God's good, that God doesn't allow suffering to come upon innocent people, and your suffering is a result then, therefore, Job, of your guilt. And you need, Job, to repent, and God will restore you. Now, of course, you and I know as the readers that that's not the case at all. It has nothing to do with what Job did. In fact, Job is suffering precisely because he's righteous, not because of anything that he's done that's wrong. And the Job's three friends get this bad reputation because they begin to transplant themselves from sitting beside Job and sympathizing with him to answering his distress and addressing the cause of his suffering. And that's why they get the judgment as being poor comforters, as Job himself calls them later on in one of his speeches. It's for that reason that they get God's judgment on them in chapter 42, because they misspoke about who God is. And I think this tells us a lot about what it means to have people that we lean upon, and also to be people that other people are able to lean upon. I've sat with numerous people that have gone through times of suffering. And as much as they answer really hard questions sometimes, I've become convinced that they don't always want the answer. Because even if they had the answer, if there was one, it would not relieve their suffering. Having the answer about why we're suffering does not necessarily relieve the suffering. So the question, what we need in those times, is not someone who's willing to give us an answer, but someone who's willing to hear the question. And that's where Job's three friends go astray. They move from people that were sitting with him in the midst of this, who could have simply heard the question, to being the people who needed to give the answer. If we want a secret of what it is to have someone we can lean upon, who in our life is able to handle our difficult questions? Not to judge us, not necessarily to give us an answer, but someone who we trust enough to be able to share our questions with. That's the person that we need in our life that we can lean upon. Now, there are other people in our life that we need to be able to go and get answers from. We need answer people. But we also need that person in our life that's willing to hear the questions without trying to give us a simple answer to those. Who in your life fulfills that role for you? Who do you have that you can share that with? We all need someone that we can share those questions with. Not necessarily getting an answer, but someone we can at least share the question with. And on the flip side, do we the privilege of having that role in the life of someone else? Someone that can just ask the questions without us necessarily giving or trying to give all the easy answers to. Can we be the 7-day friends of Job, not the friends that show up on the 8th day?